Welcome to Reflections on Identity, a podcast series exploring educators' narratives on their professional identity. Today we are talking to Darren Bourne, who is an educational consultant and a former director of a private provider in FE and HE. Darren, would you like to say a little bit about your current role and the role you had before then?
Sure. Yeah, it's probably about just over 2 years ago, kind of October 23, I think it was. I left the organisation I was with at the time. I had been there actually for well over 20 years. So in different kind of like slightly different roles as the time went by. So well ensconced in it. It was it was basically a large provider that ran kind of FE and HE provision through franchise contracts. So quite an interesting kind of organisation that kind of sat in the middle between lots of different I guess identities. I guess. So kind of I left that and moved out of that and kind of I wanted a bit of a slower pace of life. Kind of I concentrated more on my music making. I probably consider myself more of a musician now than an educator, but obviously I'm still doing the consultancy stuff. I'm doing some external examining stuff, external examining work, and also some little projects. And there's a project I'm just working on now in terms of student well-being, which is really interesting. So I'm in the fortunate position of allowing, being able to pick and choose a little bit. And hopefully keep the wolf from the door at the same time. So yes, it's quite a fluid role. I'll take on projects as they arrive. I've done some writing as well. So yeah, it's all fairly flexible. So in terms of identity, I would consider myself to not have a very strict identity right now because of the various roles that I'm kind of doing. Even though looking back just over 2 years, I probably had a very strong identity in terms of like that specific role in that specific organisation. If that makes sense.
Thank you for that introduction, Darren. Um, could you tell us how important you think professional identity is?
I would say it's mission critical. I think it's really important because I think it's the space from which you act. It's the basis of your role, really. I guess it's like a confidence. So it's like the little it's the sun around which you orbit, I guess. And although it's in some sense it's fluid, I think it's really important to have it as that touch point. And I think it's interesting, isn't it, that identity evolves as your career evolves, and so in a funny sort of way, I guess my my identity is in the latter stages. It's much more kind of open and kind of maybe more of a mentory type of consultancy type of kind of role rather than a specific role within things. But yeah, I think it's really important, and it's I think there are many thinkers who would say it's been under attack now for quite some time, this idea of professional identity and the marketization and so on. So, I hold it quite dear as a kind of something that's important to develop, if that makes sense.
Great. Yeah. Would you say that because you've talked about your role as being quite mixed and you've gone through this transition, haven't you, in various roles? Do you think your role has influenced your identity as an educator?
I think so. I think again, I think there's a bit of an interplay, isn't there, between uh, uh, when I was thinking about kind of because you sent some of the questions through beforehand, I was kind of thinking, well, what actually is the difference between role and identity? It kind of in a funny sort of way, you can think about them in the same breath almost. It's kind of like because in a funny sort of way, the your identity almost defines the roles you can undertake. And then the roles you undertake kind of then influence your identity. So it's a bit of a dialectic for me. And so, yeah. So sorry, just repeat the question.
It was really your role, or I suppose in your case, it would be one of your roles,
Yeah.
whether it influences that educator part of you, so the teaching element of what you do.
Yeah. No, I think it does. I think any role you play will have some kind of influence. I mean, I was gonna kind of mention I have quite a strong kind of meditation practice. So there's something about how one develops your identity is an interesting question for me, because I know how difficult it is, when you're working on yourself. I know how difficult it is to make those kind of like highly personal changes, and I think that's probably true of professional changes too. There's something about the inertia in the system that's in some ways helpful, because it has an inertia, and so therefore it has an ability to kind of give you something back. But at the same time, I think it's reasonably difficult to change. Yeah.
I just wanted to come in, Darren, just very, very briefly, just to ask whether your identity is different now. Well, obviously, I guess it is different now, but in what ways is it different being an educator to being a manager in education, or do you see them as somehow the same?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, casting my mind back into the role more, sort of thing. I often thought of my role as a manager as being a parallel to teaching, and not that the people I was managing were my class, but there's a hop up a logical level to understanding it in that way, that you are kind of you're helping develop either the project or the direction, or so on. And so in many ways, kind of like your class or the people you're managing, and they're managing you too. It's kind of there's an interaction in the class. It's so I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. I think I explicitly kind of spoke about it from like that from time to time, to try and get people to understand why I was doing things in the way that I was doing them, sort of thing. Because as educators, obviously they understood that interaction, so it was helpful in some ways, I guess.
Mm. I think you've talked about this a little bit. You've alluded to this in terms of your meditation practice and thinking about self and identity as a result of that. How much influence, I know you're in quite a different position, having had a leadership role and a teaching role and now a consultancy one. How much influence do you feel you've had on your professional identity?
Interesting, yeah. I want to say quite a lot, but I've also got to I've got to accept that the things that I've done have formed my identity. So did I really have as much choice as I thought? Possibly not, actually, to be fair. And so again, it's that kind of dialectic. It's almost like my identity is like a congealment of everything I've ever done, in a funny sort of way. So in that sense, I've had no control over it at all. Although there is definitely a feeling of agency. There's definitely a feeling of, this is how I'd like to teach. This is how I'd like to manage. This is my approach, and it's always felt like a very personal approach. So in that sense, the way I approach it kind of like helps it form in a particular way, maybe. But it's woolly. It's very grey. What affected what, and what caused what. I mean, just in a slightly tongue-in-cheek comment, kind of going back to the meditation practice thing, Buddhism would claim that there's no self at the center of it all anyway. They just keep taking off the onion skins, and there's nothing in the center. So in a funny sort of way, that this question of identity is really fascinating, because in many ways, from certain perspectives, it's illusory. It doesn't actually exist, and yet it helps you, and yet it helps you kind of like achieve certain things. So it's an interesting question. Yeah.
And you mentioned that in relation to agency as well, didn't you? That sense of, so do you feel your sense of professional identity has helped with your agency? Are they interrelated?
I think again, interrelated. I think, again, it's a bit of like I guess it's now a triple dialectic, and it's like if you can have if you're allowed to have one of those. But no, I think so. I think that, the agency, the identity, and kind of the role that are all kind of like they're mixed into one. And obviously this idea of kind of your environment and the things that you do kind of affecting the things that you're then able to do. And I think, yeah, it's complex. It's really complex. I don't have any answers in that sense.
I don't think any of us have the answers, do we? Also, so you're talking about environment. So what about other people? Are there any examples of how you feel other people might have influenced your professional identity?
I think hugely, actually, and there's there's something really interesting about the role that I used to kind of perform. In that as I mentioned, we have franchise contracts with both colleges and universities. And there was something kind of interesting about being inside but outside at the same time in that relationship, which was really fascinating. And it's not that uncommon in FE, a little bit more uncommon in HE. But what was interesting is that, for example, with the college relationship, I obviously had lots of conversations where there were various notions of who I was in relationship to the students, because the students were essentially, through the franchise contracts, college students. but the members of staff who were teaching them weren't, because they were part of a different organisation. And so there was always this very peculiar kind of liminal space that was kind of inside and outside at the same time. And in that sense, and I think kind of getting to the point, those others in other organisations made it quite complex to navigate sometimes, because it's kind of, you had to play different roles. Of kind of like, you had to be a bit more collegey in order to talk the right language, in order for someone to understand you. And then when you were in a different meeting, you had to be a bit more kind of private provider and not part of the college, because so it sometimes felt quite having to be a bit of a chameleon in order to operate in different ways with different types of conversation, because of this liminality. I'm sure that's true, in colleges. If you're in different departments, you obviously there's different conversations, different languages and so on. But it felt particularly kind of like at the sharp end of that particular kind of set of issues. And I found it completely fascinating. In fact, it was kind of it underpinned a lot of my thesis, sort of thing. So it was just like a really interesting kind of like situation to be in. And so not only did we have kind of that college interaction, we also had a university interaction, because we had HE students as well. And what was really interesting about that is that you've got your college, which is much larger than the organisation I was working with, but then you've got a university with it's much, much larger than that. And so there's this sense of scale that we're constantly hopping between, which made it really fascinating and sometimes very difficult to identify what identity I needed to be playing in any particular kind of situation. And it became I guess a kind of like a skill. Kind of like it became a kind of like you needed to kind of keep track of where you were in all the different conversations, and fascinating. And so in that sense, that skill set, or that ability to kind of to have those conversations, very much came from others, and and how those interactions played out because of the organisational identity. And I think that's kind of where I was heading. That there's something really fascinating about, yes, we have our professional identities, but we also have these very peculiar kind of organisational identities that stain our identity in quite strong ways. And I think sometimes when if you're in one single organisation and have been for quite some time, you begin not to be able to see that. And I think that was what was interesting about where I was working, that it's almost like you couldn't not see it because you were constantly dotting around between the different organisations. So yeah, that's something I find particularly fascinating.
Thank you, Darren. That was some really interesting insights there. I'll hand over to Neil.
Thank you, everybody. You have been listening to Reflections on Identity. We hope you can join us for the next episode in our series. Click on the bell icon or follow for notifications. We'd also love to hear from you, so please put your thoughts in the comments. Bye for now.